Welcome back to Minnesota Matters. I'm Scott Peterson. The Replacements are a now more or less defunct Minnesota band whose music runs the gamut from loud, obnoxious, fast, and profane to insightful, thoughtful, pretty, and profound. It's been a long time since the group's peak in the 80s, yet their music has stood the test of time, and through the years, their legend has only grown. Their whole story is told in vivid detail in a new band biography called Trouble Boys from author Bob Mehr. I recently asked Bob what compelled him to write the book.
Well, first and foremost, I was a fan of the music and a fan of the band for many years and had read all kinds of things about the magazine stories, and there've been attempts to kind of tell their story in some books, anthology-type things, and also in oral history. But I felt like the version of the story, of the Replacement story that was out there, was a story that was told from the outside looking in, and I wanted to tell it from the inside. And I also felt that there was so much about the band that was almost presented as myth or legend or caricature in some cases of who and what they were, and I felt like all that was just sort of surface, and so I really wanted to dig in and do the research and the due diligence to kind of try and understand the band internally, in a sense, and the lives they led as people and the career they had as a group.
For those of our listeners out there that maybe aren't familiar with the band, this may be a difficult thing to do since you spent so many years
Right.
On this. But what would you say to those folks if you were going to give them a sort of capsule description of what the band is and why it's important all these years after they broke up?
Well, the Replacements were a band from Minneapolis, started in 1979, broke up at least in their original incarnation in 1991. So they're really kind of a band of the 80s. They put out 8 records. Half of them were on Twin Tone, a local Minneapolis label, and half were for the Warner Brothers Sire labels. And really, they are considered, I think, generally in people's hearts and in critics' minds as one of the most beloved, important, and influential bands from that period. That's and Paul Westerberg, their singer-songwriter, one of the great songsmiths of his era and sort of voice of a generation in his own way. And that's one part of it. Of course, they're revered and regarded and wrapped in so much romance because of their wild antics and all these stories you hear about their shows and the way they performed and lived and all that sort of stuff. So it's a combination of factors that I think make them a really compelling story and an important Minnesota story, too.
You call the book Trouble Boys, and that's not a coincidence. Maybe if you could tell me what it is about that title and what its origin is that you chose that to be the name of the book.
Well, it's actually the name of a Dave Edmunds song, or a Billy Bremner song done by Dave Edmunds, and it was one of the first songs that the band, the early Replacements, really kind of came together on. They found their sound rehearsing in the first few months, playing that song, and so it was a little bit of a flashpoint moment. And of course, I like the double meaning. The Replacements were a fairly troublesome group, mostly for their managers and their record label and people in the music industry. They were very willful and headstrong, and did some things or didn't do other things that were kind of went against the grain of the traditional music business approach. So it had Trouble Boys had a double meaning and in some ways a triple meaning because they came personally from somewhat troubled backgrounds. So it seemed like it had multiple layers there that made it an ideal title for the book.
And you alluded to this just a moment or so ago, but how much of an impact was their location or coming from Minnesota? How much of an impact did that have on them being Trouble Boys and being the group that they were?
Oh, I think the thing about the Replacements is so much of who they were and what they were came out in the band and in their music. So it's almost inseparable in terms of the geographic, the socioeconomic, the time period that they came up in. These were folks that were children of World War II veterans or coming out of that post-war era. It's a much different time. They were mostly blue-collar, mostly Catholic, very Minnesotan. And so all those factors, I think, were essential to who they were and how they sounded and the way they approached their career, too, to a great extent. So all that's very much wrapped in that regional identity into their career and to their music.
And, we are here 35, 36 years later still talking about them. I think the primary reason for that is the songs. What is it about the songs that resonates with those of us who care and still listen all these years later?
I think, with Paul, it's a mix of things. I mean, naturally a gifted wordsmith, and it's a kind of, he plays with words and plays with imagery in a really beautiful way. But I think even more than that, there's an emotionalism that comes out in his songs that probably doesn't come out anywhere else. And so there's a tremendous impact there. I mean, he says it himself. He would sort of mine his feelings for his songs, and I think, you get a sense of that. His music and those songs, particularly the ones he was writing in the kind of peak period between, say, 84 and 87, and really throughout his career, but in terms of replacement songs, they connected with people on different levels. It was head music, it was heart music, it was gut music, it was all those things, and I think that's why those songs have lasted and become, anthems and classics in their own right, for not just for his generation, but for successive generations.
Well, thanks so much for writing the book and sharing the story. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on, Scott. I appreciate it.